I was broke, like skip meals for 2 days broke. So when my friend said just one night, he's rich, he pays well, I said yes. I didn't know that a single desperate decision would trap me in a dark, twisted world I could never, ever escape from. Because the man I spent that night with, he wasn't just rich. He was a ruthless billionaire. He was the owner of the massive corporation where I spent my nights scrubbing toilets. And by morning I realized he didn't just own the building. He already owned me too. Before I reveal the sickening truth of what this man did to me and how a single night turned into a psychological prison, you need to hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and turn on all notifications. Seriously, you do not want to miss the rest of this story, and your support helps me finally expose what really goes on behind the closed doors of the ultra-rich. Have you subscribed? Good, because you are not ready for this. I had been living in Tokyo for 8 agonizing months. I had no family here, no connections, just a suffocating, terrifying mountain of debt. Back home, my mother was lying in a hospital bed, needing a surgery we could never afford, and the bills just kept piling up, burying me alive. My job cleaning the corporate offices of one of Japan's biggest tech conglomerates barely paid enough to keep the lights on in my cramped, freezing apartment, let alone feed me. I was a ghost in this neon city. Invisible, starving, desperate. That's when my coworker cornered me in the supply closet. She saw me crying over a past due notice. She leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper, and told me a secret of the underground city. Foreign businessmen pay for company, she said, just to look pretty, just for one night. One night with the right man could solve everything, Amara. I resisted. Of course I resisted. I had morals, I had pride. But pride doesn't pay for life-saving surgery. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was the hospital. The voice on the other end was cold, clinical, and completely indifferent to my tears. If you don't wire the funds by the end of this week, we are stopping your mother's treatment. That was it. That was the exact moment my spirit broke. I called my coworker back, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the phone, and I told her to set it up. A few hours later, I was standing in the hallway of the most exclusive, hyper-luxurious penthouse hotel in Tokyo. It was too quiet, the kind of absolute dead silence that only millions of dollars can buy. The air itself smelled expensive, heavy with cedar and expensive cologne. I felt like a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. I shouldn't be here. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to sprint back to the elevators and never look back. But then the heavy oak doors clicked open, and he walked in. He was tall, terrifyingly tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than I would make in a decade. He was Japanese, maybe in his early 30s, with sharp, striking features carved from ice. But it wasn't his looks that froze the blood in my veins. It was his eyes. He didn't look at me like I was a woman. He didn't look at me like I was even a human being. He looked at me the way a predator looks at a trapped bird, like something he had already decided to consume, like he already owned me. He didn't tell me his name. He didn't offer me a drink. He didn't even say hello. He just walked slowly across the plush carpet, stopped inches from my face, and whispered in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. "Don't speak unless I ask you to." That should have been my warning. That should have been the moment I ran. But I needed the money. I needed it to save my mother's life. So God help me, I stayed. I slipped out before the sun even crested the Tokyo skyline. My shoes made no sound on the thick hotel carpets. In my trembling hand, I clutched a thick, heavy envelope. The money was there, enough to save my mother. But as I rode the gold-plated elevator down to the lobby, my reflection in the mirrored doors looked like a complete stranger. My dignity was shattered into a million jagged pieces. I wrapped my thin coat tightly around myself, stepping into the freezing morning air, and whispered to the empty, neon-lit streets, "It's over. I have the money. I'll never ever see him again." I was so foolishly, tragically wrong. The very next morning I was back in my gray, shapeless uniform, head down, scrubbing the marble floors of the corporate lobby, invisible again, just a nameless cleaner in a sea of suits. But at exactly 8:45 a.m., the entire building suddenly went dead silent. The usual chaotic hum of the morning rush completely vanished. Dozens of high-level executives rushed out of the elevators, lining up in a perfectly straight, terrified row. The security staff stiffened, bowing at precise, 90-degree angles. I pressed myself against the wall, confused, until I heard my manager hiss to a coworker, "The CEO is here. Don't look at him." My stomach instantly dropped into a black pit. No, no way. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my mop bucket with sweating palms, and dared to peek through the crowd. And when I looked up, the breath violently left my lungs. It was him. The exact same man from the penthouse, the same terrifying, cold eyes. But instead of the secrecy of midnight, he was now draped in absolute, undeniable power. He wasn't just some anonymous billionaire client. He was the CEO. He was my boss. As he strode through the lobby like a god walking among peasants, his gaze swept over the bowing employees. And then, his eyes locked directly onto mine. I was standing in the shadows, disguised in a cleaner's uniform, miles below his tax bracket, but it didn't matter. He stopped. Time stopped. For a torturous second, his face was entirely blank. And then the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a slow, dangerous, bone-chilling smile. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. It was ownership. In that suffocating moment, a horrifying realization hit me like a freight train. He had known. Even that night in the hotel room, he knew exactly who I was. He knew I scrubbed his floors. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a trap. Barely an hour later, the intercom in the maintenance closet crackled to life. My manager's voice was trembling. "Amara, you are summoned to the top floor." The top floor, the executive suite, a place cleaners were strictly forbidden to even breathe in during the day. The elevator ride-up felt like an execution march, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought they would crack. When the doors slid open, the silence was deafening. His office was massive, a sprawling kingdom of glass and cold, untouchable steel, just like him. He was sitting behind a massive desk, reading a file. He didn't even bother to look up when I stepped inside. He simply spoke, his deep voice slicing through the quiet room. "Close the door." My hands were shaking so hard, I could barely grasp the handle. I pushed the heavy door shut, and the soft click of the latch sounded like a prison cell locking behind me. He finally looked at me. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and watched me with the terrifying calm of a predator who has already cornered his prey. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until I felt like I was going to pass out. Then he spoke. His voice was smooth like dark silk. "You broke the rules." I froze, my mind raced, stumbling over the words. "What? What rules? I did what you paid me to do." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "You left without permission." My heart stopped beating. I waited for the punchline, for the hint of a smirk, but there was nothing. He wasn't making a cruel joke. He was entirely dead serious. I didn't say another word. I turned, practically running out of the office, slamming my hand against the elevator button. I was going to quit. I was going to pack my bags, take my mother, and leave Tokyo forever. I marched straight down to Human Resources that very same hour and slammed a hastily written resignation letter on the desk. The HR representative barely glanced at it before pushing it back. "Rejected," she said coldly. "You can't reject a resignation," I shouted. But when I tried to use my employee access card to leave the floor, the reader flashed red. Denied. Panic started to claw at my throat. I ran out of the building through the fire exit, sprinting to the nearest ATM to withdraw the cash he had given me. The machine beeped aggressively. Account frozen for verification. My phone buzzed. It was an email from my landlord, demanding immediate payment for the next 6 months of rent, or I would be evicted by nightfall. I stood there on the busy Tokyo sidewalk, surrounded by millions of people, feeling entirely, utterly alone. Everything in my life was collapsing, all at once. It wasn't bad luck. It was orchestrated. Someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes, tearing down every single pillar of my survival. Because someone was. I had no choice. I was entirely backed into a corner, completely stripped of my resources, my escape routes, my life. I had to go back. I took the agonizing elevator ride back to the top floor, back to that office, back to him. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't even let me speak. As I approached his desk, trembling with rage and terror, he simply reached into his drawer and slid a thick, bound contract across the polished wood. "You will stay," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Tears of pure frustration spilled over my eyelashes. My voice cracked as the words finally escaped me. "Why me? You could have anyone in this city. You could have supermodels, actresses. Why me?" He stood up slowly. He walked around the edge of the massive desk, his footsteps silent on the rug, until he was standing so close to me that I couldn't even breathe. He leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear, and whispered, "Because you looked at me like you hated me." A terrible pause hung in the air. Then his voice dropped an octave colder. "No one does that." This wasn't a twisted romance. This wasn't some dark fairy tale where the billionaire falls in love with the maid. This was about absolute control. He didn't want me because I was special or beautiful. He wanted me because I had resisted him, because I had taken his money and walked out without worshiping the ground he walked on. Because, for one fleeting second, I made him feel something he couldn't completely dominate. And so he decided he would break me. Slowly, carefully, completely. The days blurred into agonizing weeks. I was no longer a cleaner. I was his personal assistant, though I did no actual work. I was simply required to exist within his orbit, and the rules appeared, tightening around my throat like a noose. I couldn't quit. I couldn't date. I couldn't travel outside the city limits. I had to answer his phone calls before the third ring, no matter what time of day or night. And the most twisted, agonizing part of it all: he never touched me again. Not like that first night. There was no passion, no physical obsession. Instead, he systematically controlled my life piece by piece. He controlled where I lived, what I ate, who I spoke to. He isolated me until the only person I could rely on, the only person I was entirely dependent on for my very survival, was him. Until one night the illusion shattered. I was working late, arranging files in the quiet, dim light of the executive lounge. Two senior board members walked past the cracked door, holding crystal glasses of whiskey, their voices hushed. "I see the CEO has a new pet," one of them chuckled darkly. "He's done this before," the other whispered back. "And you know how it ends. Girls like her. They never leave." My blood ran completely cold. The files slipped from my hands, scattering across the floor. I wasn't the first. I was just the newest addition to his collection. And as the terrifying reality washed over me in the dark, empty office, I knew one thing for certain. Unless I found a way to escape this beautiful nightmare, I wouldn't be the last. I couldn't breathe. My hands scrambled across the floor, desperately gathering the scattered files before anyone noticed they had fallen. I wasn't the first. The thought repeated in my head, a rhythmic, sickening drumbeat. Who were they? Where were they now? I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. I hid in the women's restroom on the 40th floor until the building's motion sensors dimmed the lights to a cool, artificial blue, until I was absolutely sure the executives had left, and more importantly, until I was sure he had left. My hands shook as I approached the heavy doors of his private suite. As his personal assistant, I had the highest level of keycard access. It was a twisted sign of his absolute trust in my obedience. He thought he had broken me completely. He thought I was too terrified to ever cross him. He was wrong. Fear had paralyzed me for weeks, but in the dark of that hallway, the terror was crystallizing into something entirely different. Pure, desperate survival. I slipped into his office, the massive glass windows overlooking the glittering, oblivious city of Tokyo. I didn't dare turn on the lights. I crept behind his massive steel desk and opened his laptop. Password protected, of course. But I had stood silently behind him a dozen times while he typed it in. He never bothered to hide it from me because to him I wasn't a threat. I was property. Enter, the screen illuminated my pale face. I bypassed the corporate folders, the financial projections, the board meeting minutes. I dug deeper, into the hidden partitions, into the personal encrypted archives. It took me 45 minutes of frantic, sweating searching before I found it. A single folder, buried deep in the system, titled only with an underscore. I clicked it. My stomach violently rejected itself. Dozens of subfolders populated the screen. Each one bore a first name, Yuki, Alina, May, Sarah, and at the very bottom created exactly 2 months ago, Amara. My vision blurred as I opened the first folder, Yuki. It wasn't just a personnel file. It was a complete, terrifying psychological dissection. Bank records, family histories, deepest fears, medical debts. He hadn't just chosen these women randomly. He hunted them. He found women who were drowning, women who had no safety net, and he offered them a lifeline, only to wrap it around their necks. But the most horrifying part wasn't the surveillance. It was the final document in Yuki's folder, a legal transfer of assets, a non-disclosure agreement signed with a shaky hand, and a medical report from a private, highly secure psychiatric facility on the outskirts of Hokkaido. Patient admitted for severe nervous breakdown, indefinite hold. I clicked the next folder. Elena, deported after a mysterious, fabricated string of felony charges were filed against her. May missing. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle the sob clawing its way out of my throat. He didn't just break them. When he was done playing with them, when they finally stopped resisting and became the lifeless dolls he wanted, he disposed of them. He erased them from the world. And now I was next. Click, the sound of the heavy office door unlatching behind me was louder than a gunshot. I wondered why your phone's location tracker was still showing you in the building. His voice sliced through the darkness, calm, smooth, laced with a terrifying, icy curiosity. I slammed the laptop shut, spinning around so fast my knees almost buckled. He was standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim hallway lights. He hadn't left. He walked slowly toward me, his footsteps echoing like a countdown on the hardwood floor. He didn't look angry. That was the most terrifying part. He looked amused. "What were you looking for, Amara?" he whispered, stopping just inches from me. The scent of cedar and cold power washed over me, suffocating me. "Nothing," I lied, my voice shaking so violently I sounded like a terrified child. I was just finishing the quarterly reports. I lost track of time." He reached out, his long, cold fingers brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. The touch made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to stay perfectly, agonizingly still. "You're lying," he stated simply. "But that's okay. It means there's still a spark of defiance left in you." His hand moved down to my jaw, gripping it with a sudden, bruising force. He forced my face up, making me stare directly into those hollow, soulless eyes. "Go home, Amara," he commanded softly. "Pack your things, all of them." A cold sweat broke out across my spine. Why? His smile was a razor blade in the dark. "Because starting tomorrow, you don't live in that pathetic apartment anymore. You're moving into my penthouse, and you are never, ever leaving." I didn't sleep that night. I didn't cry either. The terror had burned away, leaving nothing but a cold, hollow shell of absolute clarity. If I panicked, I would end up like Alina. If I fought him head-on, I would end up in a psych ward like Yuki. And if I ran, I would end up missing, like May. So as the morning sun clawed its way over the Tokyo skyline, I packed my single, frayed suitcase. His black town car was waiting at the curb. The driver didn't say a word as he loaded my meager belongings into the trunk. The drive to the penthouse was a blur of gray concrete and flashing neon, a funeral procession for the life I used to have. When the private elevator doors opened into his residence, the sheer scale of it stole the air from my lungs. It was an absolute fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass, black marble, and cold, imported steel. It hovered above the city like a god's throne, entirely detached from the world of the living down below. He was waiting in the center of the massive living room, pouring a cup of black coffee. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up, looking so casually domestic it made me sick to my stomach. "Welcome home, Amara," he said softly, not looking up from his cup. He gestured to a polished oak table. Sitting perfectly in the center was a brand-new phone, a heavy platinum credit card, and a pair of diamond earrings that cost more than my mother's entire surgery. "Your old phone is gone," he stated, finally raising his eyes to meet mine. "Your old bank accounts are closed. You will use these. If you attempt to contact anyone outside of my approved list, I will know before the call even connects. If you attempt to leave the building without my security detail, the elevators will lock down." He walked toward me, his footsteps silent on the marble. He stopped, picking up the diamond earrings, and reached out to brush my hair aside. I forced every muscle in my body to remain perfectly still. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. "You are going to learn to like it here," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "You are going to learn to be exactly what I need." And in that moment, a terrifying, desperate plan formed in my mind. I would give him exactly what he wanted. He wanted a pet. I would be the perfect, obedient pet. He wanted a doll. I would let him pull the strings. Because I knew the only way to escape a man who controls everything is to make him believe he has completely won. To make him so arrogant, so utterly confident in his domination, that he stops looking over his shoulder. So I looked up into his cold, soulless eyes, and I forced the corners of my mouth into a soft, submissive smile. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice smooth and compliant. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face, just a fraction of a second, before a smug, victorious satisfaction settled in his eyes. He thought he had broken me in record time. He thought the fight was over. But the fight hadn't even started. For the next 3 weeks I played the role perfectly. I wore the expensive silk dresses he bought me. I attended the lavish, suffocating corporate dinners, standing silently by his side like a prized trophy. I let him dictate my schedule, my meals, my every waking breath. And all the while I watched. I memorized the security guard rotations. I memorized the blind spots in the penthouse camera system. I memorized the rhythmic, predictable patterns of his arrogance. Until one afternoon, while he was locked in a brutal boardroom negotiation across the city, I found it. I was in his private library, dusting the rows of first edition books, a chore he insisted I do myself, purely to humiliate me. I reached for a heavy, leather-bound volume on the highest shelf. As I pulled it down, something slipped from between the yellowed pages and fluttered to the Persian rug. It was a piece of hotel stationery. I knelt down, my heart hammering against my ribs, and turned it over. It wasn't just a scrap of paper. It was a note. The handwriting was frantic, the ink smeared as if it had been written in a terrifying rush. "If you are reading this, he has chosen you next. Do not trust the Wi-Fi. Do not eat the food he brings you from the restaurant on the ground floor. He drugs it to make you compliant. Look behind the mirror in the guest bathroom. I left something that can help you. Don't let him win." Yuki. My blood turned to pure ice. Yuki, the girl who was supposedly locked in a psychiatric ward, she had been here. She had stood in this exact room, breathing this exact, suffocating air. I shoved the note into my pocket and sprinted toward the guest bathroom, my bare feet slapping against the marble floors. I locked the heavy door behind me, staring at my pale, terrified reflection in the massive mirror. My hand shook violently as I pressed my fingers against the edge of the glass, feeling for a seam. Click, the mirror popped forward on a hidden hinge, and what was sitting in the dark cavity behind it changed absolutely everything. What do you think Yuki left hidden behind that mirror? A weapon, a key, or a secret far more dangerous than Amara could ever imagine? Has Amara already eaten the drugged food without realizing it? And most importantly, can you ever truly outsmart a billionaire predator who controls every single aspect of your reality? Or is she just walking blindly into his final trap? You are not going to believe what she finds and what she has to do to survive. If you want to find out exactly what happens next in part 2, you need to hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button and make sure you turn on all notifications so you don't miss the mind-blowing conclusion to this story. Drop your wildest theories in the comments below about what's hiding behind that glass. I'll be reading them. See you in part 2.